Story 1. The Silent Intruder. I always prided myself on being a light sleeper. Living alone in a small, cozy apartment downtown, I felt secure in my ability to wake at the slightest noise. That all changed one cold December night. It began with a faint rustling sound. I dismissed it as the wind shifting in my bed to a more comfortable position. But the noise persisted, growing louder, more distinct. It was as if someone was moving inside my apartment, shuffling through my things. I sat up, heart pounding, straining my ears to catch any sound. Silence. Maybe I had imagined it. I laid back down, closing my eyes. Then came the unmistakable creak of a floorboard just outside my bedroom door. Panic surged through me. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. Before I could press the call button, my bedroom door slowly creaked open. My breath caught in my throat. A dark figure stood in the doorway, unmoving, staring straight at me. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure remained motionless, shrouded in darkness, its presence an oppressive weight in the room. My mind raced with possibilities: a burglar, a deranged neighbor, or something far worse. I mustered the courage to speak. "Who are you? What do you want?" My voice sounded small, fearful. The figure remained silent, but the air grew colder, a chill seeping into my bones. Then, without a sound, it moved, gliding rather than walking. It approached my bed. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the headboard. The figure loomed over me, its face hidden in shadows. I could feel its icy breath on my skin. "Please, leave me alone," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The figure's hand reached out, long fingers stretching towards me. I shut my eyes, bracing for the worst, but nothing happened. I opened my eyes to find the figure gone, the room empty. Shaken, I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived within minutes, searching the apartment thoroughly. They found no sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone having been there. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. That night changed me. I moved out of the apartment the next day, unable to stay another minute in that place. Even now, years later, I can still feel that icy breath on my skin, see that dark figure standing in the doorway. I'll never forget the silent intruder that invaded my home and my nightmares. Story 2. The Unsettling Encounter. It was supposed to be just another night out with friends, but it turned into an experience that haunts me to this day. We decided to explore the old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. The place had a reputation for being haunted, but we dismissed it as just local folklore. We arrived at the mansion just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the dilapidated structure. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding as we stepped through the broken gate and made our way to the front door. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of decay and neglect. Dust-covered furniture and cobwebs draped across the ceilings added to the atmosphere of desolation. We split up to cover more ground, each of us armed with a flashlight. I found myself in what must have been the library. Shelves lined with old, forgotten books loomed over me, their spines cracked and pages yellow with age. As I ran my flashlight over the titles, a cold breeze brushed against my neck. I turned, expecting to see one of my friends playing a prank, but there was no one there. Shaking off the unease, I continued exploring. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably human. "Get out!" I froze, my heart racing. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I called out to my friends, but my voice echoed back to me in the empty room. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room, its features obscured by the darkness. It moved closer, and I could make out its form, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. He raised a hand and pointed directly at me. Fear paralyzed me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure advanced slowly, its footsteps silent on the dusty floor. Just as it was within arm's reach, the lights flickered, and the figure vanished. I bolted from the library, my mind in a frenzy. I found my friends in the hallway, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They had seen the same figure, heard the same chilling whisper. We didn't need to say anything. We ran out of the mansion, not stopping until we were safely back in town. We never spoke of that night again, each of us carrying the memory like a dark shadow. The mansion still stands a silent sentinel to our unsettling encounter, and I know I'll never set foot in that place again. Story 3. The Vanishing Neighbor. I had always considered Mrs. Thompson, my elderly neighbor, to be somewhat of an enigma. Living alone in her large, decaying house, she kept mostly to herself. We would exchange pleasantries now and then, but that was the extent of our interactions. One summer evening, I noticed something unusual. Mrs. Thompson hadn't been seen for several days. Initially, I brushed it off, thinking she might be visiting family or simply keeping to herself more than usual. But as the days turned into a week, concern gnawed at me. I decided to check on her, hoping to find everything in order. Her front door was slightly ajar, which was unlike her. Hesitantly, I stepped inside, calling out her name. The house was eerily silent, each room filled with the stale air of neglect. I made my way through the dimly lit hallways, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. In the living room, I found signs of a hurried departure, a half-drunk cup of tea, an open book lying face down on the sofa, and a cardigan draped over the back of a chair. But no sign of Mrs. Thompson. As I turned to leave, a framed photograph on the mantel caught my eye. It was a picture of Mrs. Thompson, much younger, standing with a man and a young girl. Her family, I presumed. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I noticed something peculiar. In the reflection of the glass, there was a figure standing behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. Heart pounding, I backed out of the house and called the police. They arrived quickly, searching the house from top to bottom. No signs of a struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. The officers assured me they would investigate, but days turned into weeks with no news. It was as if Mrs. Thompson had vanished into thin air. Life moved on, but the mystery of her disappearance lingered. One night, months later, I woke to a soft knocking at my door. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to the door and peered through the peephole. There, standing in the dim light, was Mrs. Thompson. She looked exactly the same as the last time I had seen her. I opened the door, my mind racing with questions. "Mrs. Thompson, where have you been?" She smiled faintly, her eyes hollow and distant. "I had to go away for a while, but I'm back now." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I stood there, baffled and uneasy. The next day, I went to check her house, but it was as empty as before. No sign of her, no indication she had ever returned. To this day, I don't know where Mrs. Thompson went or why she came back. Her house remains empty, a silent reminder of the vanishing neighbor who still haunts my thoughts. Story 4. The Eerie Discovery. Moving to a small, rural town was supposed to be my escape from the chaos of city life. I had always dreamed of living in a quaint, historic house surrounded by nature. When I found the perfect place, a charming 19th century cottage on the edge of a dense forest, I thought my dreams had come true. However, I quickly realized that dreams can turn into nightmares. The cottage was everything I had hoped for: rustic charm, a beautiful garden, and the soothing silence of the countryside. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Hargrove, had passed away under mysterious circumstances, but I didn't let that deter me. The house was a bargain, and I was eager to start a new chapter in my life. My first few weeks were blissful. I spent my days exploring the forest, gardening, and slowly renovating the house. One sunny afternoon, while clearing out the attic, I stumbled upon an old locked trunk. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to find a way to open it. After a bit of searching, I found the key hidden under a loose floorboard. As I unlocked the trunk, a chill ran down my spine. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, letters, and a dusty journal. The photographs were unsettling, depicting various people in the house, all with blank expressions and vacant eyes. The letters were written in a language I didn't recognize, filled with strange symbols and diagrams. The journal, however, was written in English. The entries in the journal were dated back to the late 1800s and detailed the life of a man named Edgar Whitley. He described how he had come to own the cottage and his growing obsession with the occult. As I read further, the entries became more disturbing. Edgar wrote about his attempts to contact spirits and perform dark rituals, all of which seemed to center around the house and the forest. One entry in particular caught my attention. Edgar claimed that he had discovered an ancient, hidden chamber beneath the cottage, which he believed was a portal to another realm. His final entries were frantic, describing how he had awakened something dark and malevolent. As I finished reading, the air in the attic grew cold. I could feel a presence, as if I were being watched. I quickly closed the trunk and hurried downstairs, my heart pounding. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The house, which had once felt warm and inviting, now seemed sinister. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. I would hear whispers in the dead of night, faint and unintelligible, but undeniably real. Objects would move on their own, and I would wake up to find strange symbols drawn in the dust on the floors and walls. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I began to dread being alone in the house. One evening, as I was preparing to go to bed, I heard a loud thump coming from the basement. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and descended the creaky stairs. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old furniture and boxes. As I shone the flashlight around, I noticed a small trapdoor in the corner, partially hidden under a rug. My heart raced as I approached the trapdoor. I know I should leave it alone, but something compelled me to open it. With a deep breath, I lifted the door and peered inside. A narrow stone staircase led down into the darkness. The air was thick with a musty, earthy smell, and I could feel a palpable sense of malevolence emanating from below. I descended the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The staircase seemed to go on forever, and I could hear the faint sound of chanting echoing from below. As I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small stone chamber. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols I had seen in the journal and on the walls of the house. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, and on it lay a decaying, leather-bound book. The chanting grew louder, filling my head with an overwhelming sense of dread. I approached the altar, drawn to the book despite the fear coursing through me. As I reached out to touch it, the chanting stopped abruptly, and the room fell into an oppressive silence. Suddenly, the air grew icy, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there, standing in the doorway, was a shadowy figure. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it seemed to be made of darkness itself. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The figure slowly raised its hand, and a wave of cold washed over me. I felt my strength draining away, and my vision began to blur. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, a voice whispered in my ear, "Leave this place, or suffer the same fate." as those before you. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I turned and fled up the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house and in my car, speeding away from the cottage. I never looked back. I later learned that Mr. Hargrove had been found dead in the very same chamber, his face twisted in terror. The house has remained abandoned since, a dark reminder of the eerie discovery that nearly cost me my life. Story 5: The Haunted Hospital. The decision to explore the abandoned St. Vincent's Hospital was one I had long contemplated. As an urban explorer, I was drawn to places with history and stories, especially those steeped in darkness. St. Vincent's had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, its once bustling halls now silent and decaying. The rumors of it being haunted only added to its allure. Equipped with my camera, flashlight, and a sturdy backpack, I made my way to the hospital one cold, foggy evening. The building loomed ahead, its Gothic architecture casting eerie shadows in the dim light. I hesitated at the entrance, the heavy wooden doors partially ajar as if inviting me, and taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, each step a reminder of the lives that once filled this place. I started on the ground floor, moving cautiously through the reception area and into the adjacent rooms. Old medical equipment lay scattered, rusting and forgotten. Patient records were strewn across the floor, yellowed with age. As I made my way to the second floor, the atmosphere grew colder. The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. The deeper I ventured, the more palpable the sense of dread became. It was as if the very walls were whispering secrets, tales of suffering and pain. I reached the operating theaters, large rooms with rusting surgical tables and broken lights hanging from the ceiling. Here, the air felt almost electric. I set up my camera, hoping to capture something extraordinary. As I clicked away, I heard a faint sound like a distant moan. I froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. Following the noise, I found myself in the maternity ward. The silence here was oppressive, almost tangible. I could hear the faint cry of a baby, but I knew it was impossible. The hospital had been abandoned for decades. The sound sent chills down my spine, but curiosity pushed me forward. In one of the rooms, I found an old crib, its once white paint peeling away. The cry seemed to emanate from it, growing louder as I approached. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold, my breath visible in the air. The flashlight flickered again before going out completely. I fumbled for my backup light, heart racing. When I finally managed to turn on the light, I saw her. A woman in a tattered nurse's uniform stood by the crib, her eyes hollow and dark. She stared at me, a look of profound sadness on her face. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, the chilling wail filled the room. I stumbled backward, tripping over debris as I tried to escape. The ghostly nurse followed, her wail echoing in my ears. I ran down the corridor, the sound growing fainter but still present. As I reached the stairwell, the temperature began to rise, the cold dissipating. I paused to catch my breath, looking back to see if she was still following. The corridor was empty, but the sense of being watched remained. I hurried down the stairs, desperate to leave the hospital. The walls seemed to close in on me, the whispers growing louder, urging me to flee. When I finally burst through the front doors, the fog had thickened. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys in my trembling hands. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there trying to calm my racing heart. The hospital loomed in the rearview mirror, a dark silhouette against the foggy night. I vowed never to return to St. Vincent's, but the experience haunted me. The footage I captured showed only empty rooms and corridors, no sign of the nurse or the strange occurrences. Friends and fellow explorers didn't believe my story, attributing it to an overactive imagination. But I knew what I had seen and heard. The haunted hospital was real, a place where the past lingered, and the spirits of those who had suffered were trapped. The wails of the ghostly nurse and the cries of unseen infants still echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the horrors hidden within those decaying walls. Story 6. The Creepy Caretaker. Taking a job as the caretaker for the old mansion on the outskirts of town seemed like a dream come true. I had always been fascinated by history and architecture, and this mansion, with its Victorian grandeur and eerie charm, was the perfect place to indulge both passions. The locals, however, had warned me about the mansion's dark past and the strange occurrences that were said to plague the place. But I shrugged off their stories as mere superstitions and ghost tales. The mansion had been uninhabited for years, and it was my job to maintain the property and prepare it for a potential bier. On my first day, I arrived early in the morning, the fog still clinging to the ground, giving the place an otherworldly feel. The mansion stood tall and imposing, its windows like dark eyes watching me as I approached. As I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside, I was greeted by an overwhelming sense of stillness. Dust motes floated in the air, and the wooden floors creaked under my weight. I began my duties, starting with an inspection of the various rooms. Each room seemed to hold memories of a bygone era, with antique furniture covered in white sheets and portraits of stern-looking ancestors lining the walls. By afternoon, I had made my way to the basement. The air grew noticeably colder as I descended the stairs. The basement was cluttered with old trunks, broken furniture, and stacks of newspapers yellowed with age. As I explored, I stumbled upon a door at the far end of the basement. It was locked, but the key was still in the lock. Curiosity got the better of me, and I turned the key. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a large wooden chair, and tied to it were thick ropes, frayed and worn. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. On the walls, strange symbols were drawn in what looked like dried blood. I quickly backed out, closing the door behind me, my mind racing with questions. That night, I could hardly sleep. Every creak and groan of the old mansion seemed amplified in the darkness. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a faint whispering. Sitting up, I listened carefully. The whispers were unintelligible, but they seemed to come from the basement. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. As I reached the basement, the whispers grew louder. I followed them to the locked room. The door was ajar, and a dim light flickered from within. I pushed the door open and was met with a chilling sight. The wooden chair was now occupied by a figure, bound by the same ropes. The figures had hung low, obscured by shadows. Suddenly, the figure raised its head, revealing hollow, empty eyes. A cold, malicious grin spread across its face. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. In the darkness, the figure began to speak, its voice a raspy whisper. It spoke of betrayal, pain, and vengeance. I could feel its hatred, its anger, as if it were a tangible force. I fled the basement, heart pounding, and locked myself in my room. The whispers continued throughout the night, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence in the house. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave, but the mansion seemed to have other plans. The front door, which had opened easily the day before, was now stuck fast. Windows wouldn't budge, and my phone had no signal. Trapped, I tried to keep myself busy with my duties, but the feeling of being watched never left me. That evening, as I sat in the library, the whispers returned. This time, They were accompanied by footsteps. I turned, and there stood the figure from the basement, no longer bound. It moved slowly towards me, its eyes fixed on mine. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The figure reached out, its cold fingers grazing my skin. I felt a surge of pain, and everything went black. When I awoke, I was back in the basement, tied to the chair. The figure stood over me, its grin wider than before. It spoke of how it had been betrayed and left to die in this very chair. It wanted revenge, and now I was to be its instrument. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and I felt a searing pain as they seemed to burn into my skin. Days turned into weeks. The mansion's dark past unfolded before me in horrific visions. I saw the caretaker's betrayal, the ritual that bound his spirit to the house, and the countless others who had fallen victim to his wrath. I became a prisoner, tormented by the spirit's insatiable hunger for vengeance. Escape seemed impossible. The mansion had become my prison, its walls echoing with the screams of the past. Every night, the whispers grew louder, the figure's presence more oppressive. My mind began to fracture, and I could feel myself slipping into madness. Then, one night, the whispers changed. They spoke of release, of ending the cycle of torment. The figure appeared again, but this time it offered a pact. If I could find a way to break the ritual, to sever the ties that bound it to the house, both our souls would be free. Desperate, I agreed. With renewed determination, I scoured the mansion, searching for clues. The answer lay in the symbols, a counter-ritual hidden within the lines. As I began the incantation, the house shook, the air filled with a deafening roar. The figure appeared, watching silently as I completed the ritual. In a blinding flash of light, the symbols burned away, and the figure let out a final, anguished wail. The oppressive presence lifted, and the mansion fell silent. I collapsed, exhausted but relieved. The spirit was gone, and I was free. I left the mansion at dawn, never looking back. The locals never knew what happened, and I never spoke of it. But I knew the truth. The caretaker's spirit had been laid to rest, and the mansion's dark history had come to an end. Story 7. The Abandoned Asylum. Exploring abandoned buildings was always a thrill for me, but nothing could have prepared me for the horrors I would encounter at the old Pine Hill Asylum. The asylum had been shut down for over 40 years, and stories of its haunted halls were abundant. Despite the warnings, I felt an irresistible urge to uncover the truth behind the legends. Armed with a flashlight, camera, and a notebook, I arrived at the asylum late one evening. The building stood ominously at the edge of town, its silhouette stark against the twilight sky. Vines and ivy clung to the crumbling walls, and broken windows gave it a sinister, hollow gaze. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, each step a reminder of the countless patients who once wandered these corridors. The asylum was a maze of narrow passages and empty rooms, each one more oppressive than the last. As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I started with the ground floor, moving from room to room. Old medical equipment, rusted and broken, lay scattered about. Patient records were strewn across the floor, yellowed and brittle. The deeper I ventured, the more palpable the sense of dread became. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets, tales of pain and suffering. In one room, I found an old journal, its pages filled with the scrawls of a former patient. The entries spoke of torment, of cruel experiments, and endless screams. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. The stories of abuse and neglect were more than just rumors. They were a dark reality. The basement was my next destination. The air grew colder as I descended the stairs, the darkness thickening around me. The basement was a labyrinth of rooms and hallways, cluttered with old furniture and medical supplies. As I turned a corner, I saw a door slightly ajar, a faint light flickering from within. I pushed the door open and stepped into what appeared to be an old operating room. The sight that met my eyes was horrifying. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered across a blood-stained table, and chains hung from the walls. The room reeked of fear and pain. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. As I took pictures, a cold breeze brushed past me, and I heard a faint whisper. My heart raced as I turned, but no one was there. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from the shadows themselves. Panic set in, and I fled the room, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Back on the main floor, I found myself in the children's ward. The walls were covered in faded drawings, and tiny beds lined the room. The air here was thick with sorrow, and I could almost hear the cries of the children who had once been confined here. As I walked through the ward, I heard the sound of a music box, its melody haunting and melancholy. Following the sound, I entered a small room at the end of the hall. An old, tattered music box set on a table, its lid open and the figurine spinning slowly. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold and the door slammed shut behind me. The music box continued to play, its tune growing louder and more discordant. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as the whispers returned, now accompanied by ghostly figures that flickered in and out of sight. The air was filled with their cries, their pain palpable. I was trapped, surrounded by the tormented souls of the asylum. In a desperate bid to escape, I smashed the music box, hoping to break whatever hold the spirits had on me. The figures screamed in agony as the melody stopped abruptly. The door flew open, and I stumbled out, gasping for breath. The asylum seemed to come alive around me, the walls vibrating with the screams of the damned. I ran through the corridors, the whispers and cries following me. The exit was in sight, but it felt like an eternity before I finally burst through the front doors and into the night. I collapsed on the ground, the cold air a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere inside. I never spoke of what I experienced that night, but the memories haunted me. The old Pine Hill Asylum was more than just a relic of the past. It was a place of torment and suffering, a prison for the souls of those who had been abandoned and forgotten. The legends were true, and I had narrowly escaped becoming another one of its victims. Story 8: The Unexplained Phenomenon. I've always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, paranormal activities, and supernatural events never really fazed me. That was until I encountered the unexplained phenomenon that changed everything I believed in. It all started when I moved into an old house in a quiet, rural town. The house was quaint and had a certain charm that I found irresistible. Little did I know, this house held secrets that would shatter my skepticism forever. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt an inexplicable chill. The air was heavy, and the silence was almost tangible. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. The first few nights were uneventful, but things quickly took a sinister turn. It began with faint whispers, barely audible, echoing through the empty halls. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. One night, as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard the whispers again. This time, they seemed to come from right beside my bed. My heart raced as I strained to make out the words, but they were too faint. Gathering my courage, I got up and followed the sound. It led me to the attic, a place I hadn't yet explored. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and dusty boxes. The whispers stopped as soon as I entered, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I felt a sudden drop in temperature, and a sense of dread washed over me. Despite the fear, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I quickly left the attic and locked the door behind me. The next day, I decided to do some research on the house's history. What I found was both fascinating and terrifying. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family who mysteriously vanished without a trace. Over the years, subsequent owners reported strange occurrences, leading to the house's reputation as haunted. Determined to uncover the truth, I set up cameras and audio recorders around the house. The first few nights, there was nothing unusual, but on the fourth night, the recordings captured something chilling. The cameras showed orbs of light moving erratically through the rooms, and the audio recorded whispers and faint cries. One phrase stood out among the whispers: "Help us." I played the recordings over and over, trying to make sense of them. The orbs of light could be dismissed as dust particles, but the voices were undeniable. They were desperate, pleading. I couldn't ignore them any longer. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. Armed with a flashlight and my recorder, I headed to the attic. The air grew colder with each step I took. When I reached the attic, the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. "Help us," they repeated. I demanded to know who they were and what they wanted. The temperature plummeted and the flashlight flickered. Suddenly, a figure appeared before me, translucent and ethereal. It was a young woman, her eyes filled with sorrow. She spoke in a voice that echoed with pain. "We are trapped. Help us find peace." She pointed to a dusty old trunk in the corner of the attic before disappearing. My hand shook as I approached the trunk. I opened it to find old photographs, letters, and a journal. The journal belonged to the woman, Emily, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Her family had been victims of a tragic accident, and their spirits were trapped, unable to move on. I read through Emily's journal, which detailed her family's suffering and their pleas for release. The final entry was a plea for anyone who found the journal to help them find peace. Moved by their plight, I knew I had to help. I researched ways to perform a cleansing ritual to release trapped spirits. With the necessary items gathered, I prepared for the ritual. That night, I returned to the attic, the air heavy with anticipation. I lit candles and recited the incantations, following the instructions carefully. As I performed the ritual, the whispers grew louder, more desperate. The room filled with an icy wind, and the spirits of Emily and her family appeared, their faces a mix of hope and fear. I continued the ritual, urging them to find peace and move on. The wind howled and the candles flickered violently. Then, as suddenly as it began, the wind stopped and a warm light enveloped the spirits. Emily's face softened and she whispered, "Thank you." One by one, they faded into the light, their presence lifting the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the house. Exhausted but relieved, I collapsed onto the attic floor. The house was finally at peace. The whispers ceased, and the chill in the air disappeared. I had helped the spirits find their rest, and in doing so, I had come to believe in the supernatural. The unexplained phenomenon had changed me, opening my mind to the mysteries that lie beyond our understanding. I moved out of the house shortly after, unable to stay in a place that held such haunting memories. But I never forgot Emily and her family. Their gratitude and the peace I helped bring them stayed with me. The experience taught me that some things can't be explained, and sometimes it's better to believe.